Greetings. A lot of the videos on this channel of late have been about inflation because we are currently in a phase of rapidly collapsing inflation, meaning that my predictions are turning out to have been correct. Now, of course, I had no doubt, and those of you who have been following my work regarding the atom and other associated topics knew that I have been very consistent about what the first principles of technology and economics are. However, there's a large community of people who have turned their belief in inflation into a cult of sorts. They fear something non-existent, much in the same way that Christians might fear Satan or feminists might complain about the patriarchy. Their fears of inflation and the damage it's doing and the threat it represents is entirely decoupled from any reality or any logic of what inflation really is. In reality, you can no more be for or against inflation than you can be for or against gravity. Is gravity good or bad? It's neither. Gravity has killed people because people have fallen out of windows of tall buildings or have fallen off of cliffs. Gravity has also improved the lives of people through hydroelectric electricity and so forth. But gravity is just a reality of life. Now, this cult around inflation is becoming noteworthy because it is being used as a crutch to enable people to excuse themselves of their own shortcomings or poor choices. Therefore, there's an opportunity to coin a new law about inflation. This is similar to other laws that exist that have been made by others on other topics, which I will mention. But today we're going to unveil Kartik's law of inflation. And that is, the longer any internet discussion about any topic continues, the probability of someone making a comment about inflation being a much greater crisis in modern society than it is approaches 100%. Furthermore, this mention will usually emerge before Godwin's law is fulfilled. Godwin's law, of course, is a similar law made by another person that claims that any internet discussion about any topic after it gets a certain length will inevitably result in a reference to that problematic German regime from World War II. But I claim that my law of inflation will actually be met before Godwin's law in any internet discussion, even though the two are entirely unrelated laws. Because inflation really is becoming a cult, and believing in that and virtue signaling about how much you oppose inflation or how attuned you are to the scourge of inflation has become a weird behavior on the internet and in broader society. Now we're going to go through categories of how this law manifests. I won't describe each one in detail. That will be the subject of a follow-up video, because otherwise this video will be too long, but we will run through these bullets pretty quickly. The most common manifestation, insisting that inflation is always bad and deflation is thus good. Second manifestation, insisting that inflation is deliberately understated. Presenting anecdotes as evidence of inflation. Using arguments that imply that the US is the only country in the world when discussing inflation. An inability to explain why Japan could do so much quantitative easing without inflation. Using arguments that presuppose that human prosperity today is lower than 20, 50, 100, or 200 years ago. This is a common feature of when people say the US dollar has lost some percentage of its value since a certain year. It's lost 50% of its value since X, or it's lost 96% of its value since 1920, or other such statements which are meaningless because they presuppose that human prosperity is much lower today than it was 100 years ago. And this is particularly annoying to me because I will make a blanket statement that if you really think that human beings were more prosperous a century ago or even 50 years ago than they are today, you are not an educated person. You may have memorized certain things in a certain degree program and you might have a job related to that, but you do not have a holistic education if you really think that humans were more prosperous in the somewhat distant past than they are today, because that means you are ignorant about many associated subjects around economics, technology, historical progression, finance, everything. If you really think that, then you are not a person in possession of a well-rounded education. Of course, people who watch this channel know better than to think something like that. Precluding any wealth creation as being anything other than inflation. And lastly, the same person whining about inflation simultaneously attributing his home equity gains as not inflation derived, but rather from his brilliance. This is much more of a US phenomenon, but you will see people complaining about inflation, but then bragging about how much their house went up in price and how much home equity they have gained, refusing to admit that that has anything to do with inflation. So these are the manifestations of Kartik's law of inflation. I will have another follow-up video not immediately after this that goes into detail on each of these 8 manifestations. I've already done videos around most of these, but I will consolidate them as a follow-on video to this because I would like this law to become very mainstream and well-known, because eventually there's going to be a backlash around this very fictitious and evidence-deficient narrative of inflation, as well as the illogic associated with believing all sorts of things about inflation, just like there was a similar popular uprising against the notion of Satan being omnipresent or the patriarchy being an omnipresent and sinister thing as feminists describe it. Both of those myths were destroyed when they became just too illogical and couldn't produce evidence of their claims. So that hereby is Kartik's law of inflation. Now, if you like this type of content and are interested in these subjects, then I encourage you to subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell. Thank you very much for watching.